Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, way back, to a place where the clang of swords was less common than the soft rustle of robes, and the loudest sound at dinner was often the scraping of a spoon on a wooden bowl. We're journeying into the quiet, often surprisingly complex, world of medieval monasteries to discover a truly profound question. What exactly was for dinner? Imagine yourself trudging along a muddy path, the faint scent of wood smoke mingling with damp earth. And finally, a towering stone wall looms into view. This isn't a bustling inn or a lord's lavish castle, but a sanctuary of prayer and piety, where every aspect of life, even eating, was dictated by ancient rules and profound spiritual commitment. You'll soon discover that surviving a medieval, monastic meal might be trickier than you'd think. No spontaneous pizza deliveries here, I'm afraid. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening in, let me know in the comments where you're drifting off from tonight and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle through the heavy wooden gates, your own stomach rumbling a little in anticipation, or perhaps apprehension. The first thing you'll notice inside the monastery walls, especially around meal times, is the profound silence. This isn't just a polite suggestion. It's a rule, deeply ingrained in the Benedictine rule, which governed most monastic communities across medieval Europe. Think of it. No idle chatter, no lively debates about the day's theological quandaries, certainly no complaints about the broth. Every meal was a sacred act, a communal experience of nourishment that was as much about spiritual discipline as it was about physical sustenance. You'd enter the refectory, the monastic dining hall, and take your assigned seat. Often, there would be a lector, a designated monk, reading aloud from scripture or a theological text. This wasn't just background noise, it was an integral part of the meal, intended to feed the soul as the food fed the body. So, while you're spooning your pottage, your ears are also taking in the wisdom of the church fathers. It really makes you appreciate the multitasking capabilities of medieval monks, doesn't it? The structure of the day itself revolved around these meals. There were generally two main meals, a lighter one at midday, often called prondium, and a more substantial one in the late afternoon or early evening, cena. During periods of intense fasting, especially Lent, this might be reduced to just one meal a day, taken even later. Imagine waiting all day for your single meal, your stomach doing a slow, monastic rumble. Historians still argue whether the reduction to one meal was purely for spiritual discipline or if it also served a practical purpose in times of scarcity. Regardless, the rhythm of bell tolls dictated everything. You hear the bell for matins before dawn, then lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, each chime pulling you towards another duty or another moment of prayer, until finally, the bell for the main meal. It was a life of meticulous scheduling, a stark contrast to our modern snack whenever you feel like it approach to eating. The regularity was meant to instill discipline, a constant reminder of one's vows. Even the portions were carefully controlled, sometimes distributed by a cellarer or a refectorian, ensuring no one took more than their share, and that everyone received enough, a concept of equitable distribution that was, perhaps, quite revolutionary for its time. You wouldn't find a supersize me option on the monastic menu, that's for sure. So, with the strict silence and the rigid schedule firmly established, let's talk about the absolute cornerstone of the monastic diet: bread and ale. Forget fancy pastries or artisanal sourdough. We're talking about the staff of life in its most fundamental form. You'd find a coarse, dark bread on your wooden plate at every single meal. This wasn't the fluffy white bread you might buy at the supermarket. This was often made from a mix of grains: barley, rye, sometimes oats, occasionally a bit of wheat if the monastery was particularly well off or in a good agricultural region. It was dense, nutritious, and incredibly filling, designed to sustain a body engaged in manual labor and long hours of prayer. Imagine trying to make a sandwich with this stuff. It would be less a sandwich and more a structural engineering feat. The sheer volume of bread produced was staggering. Monasteries often had their own bakehouses, complete with massive ovens. You can almost smell the yeasty, warm aroma wafting through the stone corridors, lay brothers, or sometimes even the monks themselves, would be responsible for milling the grain and baking loaf after loaf, day in and day out. This wasn't just sustenance, it was a form of self-sufficiency. A monastery aimed to be as self-contained as possible, producing its own food, brewing its own drink, and even mending its own clothes. It was a remarkably sustainable system, long before sustainability was a buzzword you'd put on your organic granola packaging. And then there was the ale. Oh, the ale. Water in medieval times wasn't always safe to drink. Wells could be contaminated, rivers could carry all sorts of unpleasantness. So, a low-alcohol ale became the beverage of choice for everyone, from peasants to kings, and especially for monks. It was essentially liquid bread, providing calories and hydration, and the brewing process made it much safer than plain water. The monks would brew vast quantities of it, sometimes several different strengths. There would be a weaker, everyday ale for general consumption and a stronger, more potent brew for special occasions or for the sick. Think of it as their equivalent of a multi-tap craft brewery, just, with fewer neon signs and more chanting. Historians still argue whether the consistent consumption of low-alcohol ale contributed to the general health of the monastic community, or if it merely masked the symptoms of other, underlying issues related to sanitation. The brewing process itself was a complex, time-consuming affair, often overseen by a designated cellarer or brewer. You'd see enormous vats, the air thick with the smell of fermenting grains. The ingredients were simple: water, malted barley or other grains, and sometimes hops or other bittering agents to preserve it and add flavor. Yeast, of course, was the magic ingredient, often simply scooped from a previous batch. It's a marvel of medieval chemistry, really, that they consistently produced a drink that was both palatable and safe. The consistent availability of bread and ale meant that, even on the leanest days, a monk would at least have a reliable source of energy. It truly was the foundation of their dietary pyramid, a pyramid that looked a lot less like our modern one and a lot more like, well, a very large loaf of bread with a pint of ale on top. While bread and ale formed the daily staples, the monastic year was punctuated by cycles of fasting and feasting. These weren't casual dietary choices. They were deeply ingrained in the religious calendar and the spiritual practices of monastic life. Imagine a year of culinary seesawing, from periods of near starvation to moments of relative indulgence. It's a system designed to test the body, purify the soul, and remind everyone of the importance of self-discipline. The most rigorous fasting period, of course, was Lent, the 40 days leading up to Easter. During this time, the already simple diet became even more austere. Meat, dairy, and often even fish were completely forbidden. You might find yourself subsisting on bread, ale, and perhaps some meager vegetables or pulses. The portions would be smaller, the meals fewer. It was a time of reflection, of penance, and of intense spiritual focus. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a juice cleanse, only far less enjoyable and significantly longer. Historians still debate the precise impact of these intense fasting periods on the health of the monks. Did it sharpen their minds and spirits, or did it merely leave them weak and irritable? The truth, as always, likely lies somewhere in between. But then came Easter. The end of Lent was a moment of profound joy, and this joy was often expressed through food. The refectory would be transformed. The silence might be slightly less rigid, the atmosphere a little more festive. You might find richer foods on your plate, perhaps eggs, which had been forbidden during Lent, or even some cheese. The ale might be stronger, the portions more generous. It was a celebration, a symbolic breaking of the fast, a recognition of the resurrection of Christ. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a post-diet cheat day, only with significantly more religious significance throughout the year. There were other feast days as well, often associated with particular saints or important events in the monastic calendar. Christmas, of course, was a major celebration, and you might find some slightly more luxurious foods on your plate then. Perhaps some spiced wine, or a richer bread, or even, if the monastery was wealthy enough, some imported delicacies. These feast days weren't just about indulging in good food. They were about celebrating community, about marking the passage of time, and about expressing gratitude for God's bounty. You'd see a brief respite from the usual austere routines, a moment to savor the fruits of their labor, both literally and figuratively. The contrast between the fasting and the feasting was a constant reminder of the cyclical nature of life, the ebb and flow of hardship and reward. It was a system that, while harsh by modern standards, provided a framework for both physical and spiritual well-being, a rhythm to the year that was as predictable as the rising and setting of the sun. To provide the necessary sustenance for both fasts and feasts, monasteries relied heavily on their own lands, and nothing was more crucial than the vegetable gardens and orchards. You step out of the refectory, perhaps a little lightheaded from the day's Lenten meal, and find yourself in a space of remarkable order and quiet productivity. These weren't just decorative patches, these were meticulously planned and tirelessly worked food factories, designed to feed dozens, sometimes hundreds, of hungry mouths throughout the year. Imagine long, neat rows of raised beds, brimming with life. You'd see a surprising variety of produce, far beyond what you might expect. Root vegetables like carrots, parsnips, and turnips were staples, easy to grow and store. Legumes, such as peas, beans, and lentils, provided much-needed protein, especially during meat-free days. Cabbages, onions, garlic, and leeks were also common, forming the basis for many a medieval pottage. It's a truly amazing thought. An entire community, sustained largely by the fruits of their own soil and their patient labor. You might even spot a monk with a particularly green thumb, tending to a rare herb or an experimental crop, a subtle nod to the early agricultural science happening within these walls. Beyond the basic vegetables, monasteries cultivated an array of herbs. These weren't just for flavor. They were vital for medicine. You'd find patches of mint, sage, rosemary, and thyme, all cultivated with care. These herbs would be used to flavor simple dishes, but also to brew medicinal teas, create poultices, and even, in some cases, to add a little something extra to the monastic ale. The knowledge of these plants and their properties was often passed down through generations of monks, making the monastic infirmary a surprisingly advanced medical center for its time. Remember that soothing balm you used for a headache, chances are some medieval monk was growing the original ingredients in his garden centuries ago. And then there were the orchards. Depending on the region, you'd wander past trees heavy with apples, pears, cherries, or plums. These fruits provided welcome sweetness and essential vitamins, especially when fresh. Much of the fruit would be eaten raw in season, but a significant portion would also be preserved, dried, or made into jams and jellies, ensuring a supply of fruit throughout the colder months. Imagine the monks gathering the harvest, the air sweet with ripening fruit, a moment of communal effort that brought tangible rewards. Historians still argue about the exact methods used for orchard management and whether particular monastic orders specialized in certain fruit varieties. What is clear, however, is the immense care and foresight that went into planning these essential food sources. The monastic garden was a living testament to patience, hard work, and a deep understanding of the natural world, all serving the humble, yet profound, goal of feeding a community. You wouldn't find any genetically modified organisms here, just pure, honest, medieval produce. Given the stringent rules on meat consumption, especially during fasting periods, fish became an absolutely critical source of protein in the monastic diet. You wander past the vegetable gardens, perhaps smelling the damp earth, and soon you might come across the monastery's fish ponds, gleaming under the medieval sun. These weren't just natural lakes. Many monasteries meticulously engineered and managed their own piscinae, or fish ponds, a testament to their self-sufficiency and ingenuity. Imagine a series of carefully constructed ponds, sometimes fed by diverted streams or natural springs. These ponds weren't just for catching wild fish, they were actively managed aquatic farms. The monks would stock them with various freshwater species, most commonly carp, pike, perch, and sometimes eels. These fish were relatively easy to breed and grow, providing a reliable and renewable source of food. It was a remarkably sophisticated system of aquaculture for its time, far more advanced than simply going fishing with a rod and line. You might even see a monk, not in quiet contemplation, but armed with a net, harvesting the day's catch, his brow furrowed in concentration. It truly puts a new spin on going fishing, doesn't it? It was more like disciplined, strategic protein acquisition. The management of these ponds involved a surprising amount of expertise. The monks had to understand water flow, oxygen levels, and the breeding cycles of different fish. They would often have separate ponds for different stages of fish growth, fry in one, larger fish in another, ready for the table. Sometimes, a special stew pond would hold fish destined for immediate consumption, ensuring freshness. Historians still argue whether the monastic innovations in fish farming significantly influenced broader medieval agricultural practices, or if they remained largely confined to the cloister. What is clear, however, is that this meticulous care ensured a steady supply of protein even when meat was strictly forbidden. When it came time for a meal, the freshly caught fish would be brought to the kitchen. It might be boiled, baked, or even fried, depending on the available resources and the particular feast day. Often, it would be served quite simply, perhaps with some herbs from the garden. For many monks, a hearty portion of fish was a welcome change from the endless pottage and bread, a small luxury in an otherwise austere existence. So, the next time you enjoy a piece of sustainable fish, you can perhaps offer a silent nod to the medieval monks who, out of necessity and piety, perfected the art of the fish pond. They truly understood the concept of farm to table, even if their farm was a series of muddy ponds and their table was a rough-hewn plank in a silent hall. Now, let's address the elephant in the refectory, or rather, the lack thereof: meat. For many monastic orders, particularly the stricter ones following the Benedictine rule, meat was largely forbidden. This wasn't just a dietary preference, it was a deeply symbolic act of asceticism and self-denial. Imagine a medieval Christmas dinner without a roasted boar or a plump capon, a truly radical concept for the time. The idea was to detach oneself from worldly pleasures, and the rich, stimulating taste of meat was considered a prime example of such indulgence. You see, the medieval understanding of food often tied closely to the concept of humus, the four essential fluids of the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, whose balance was believed to determine health and temperament. Meat, particularly red meat, was considered hot and moist, thought to incite passion and aggression. For monks striving for spiritual serenity and detachment, such a stimulating food was seen as a hindrance to their vows of chastity and humility. It was a fascinating blend of rudimentary medical theory and profound spiritual conviction that dictated what ended up on your plate. However, as with most strict rules, there were often exceptions. These exceptions sometimes arose from necessity, and sometimes, well, they were little more, shall we say, flexible. For instance, if a monk was genuinely ill, the rules might be relaxed. The infirmary, as we'll explore later, often had different dietary provisions. A sick monk might be prescribed some broth made from fowl or even a little roasted meat, considered medicinal rather than indulgent. It was a practical concession to human frailty, a recognition that even pious bodies needed nourishment to heal. Then there were the more creative interpretations of the rule. Remember our fish discussion. Some types of animals that lived in water or had a semi-aquatic lifestyle sometimes slipped through the cracks. Beavers, for example, were occasionally classified as fish due to their aquatic habits and scaly tails. Yes, you heard that right, a beaver sometimes was fish. Imagine the theological debates that must have accompanied that particular dietary loophole. Ducks and other waterfowl are also sometimes considered borderline cases. Historians still argue about the precise extent to which these interpretations were widespread and whether they reflected genuine theological reasoning or simply a practical desire for more varied protein. Regardless, it highlights the ingenuity, or perhaps the mild desperation, of medieval monks in navigating their strict dietary vows. So, while you wouldn't find a Sunday roast in the refectory, you might, just might, find something that once swam, waddled, or gnawed on a tree by a river. It certainly keeps things interesting, doesn't it? Even with the strict dietary rules, the medieval monastic kitchen was far from bland, thanks to the judicious use of spices and flavorings. You might imagine a monk's meal to be utterly devoid of zest, but you'd be surprised. While they weren't exactly tossing in a dash of everything from a modern spice rack, they certainly knew how to coax flavor out of their limited ingredients. This wasn't about culinary extravagance, but about making simple, wholesome food palatable and, at times, even delicious. One of the most crucial elements was the monastic herb garden we discussed earlier. Fresh herbs like parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme were used extensively. Imagine a simple fish stew, made vibrant with freshly chopped parsley and a hint of wild marjoram. These herbs didn't just add flavor. Many were also believed to have medicinal properties, aiding digestion or boosting general well-being. It was a practical, homegrown approach to seasoning, ensuring that even the most basic pottage had some character. You might even discover a monk carefully drying bunches of herbs in a cool, dark storeroom, preserving the summer's bounty for the long winter months. Beyond the locally grown, there were also imported spices, though these were far more precious and used sparingly, often reserved for feast days or for the abbot's table. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and ginger were incredibly expensive, traveling vast distances along ancient trade routes. The sheer cost meant they were a sign of wealth and status, even within the austere walls of a monastery. Imagine the anticipation as a tiny pinch of precious black pepper was added to a dish, a rare burst of exotic flavor that would have been truly remarkable. This wasn't about more is more. It was about subtle enhancement. Historians still argue about the precise quantities of these expensive spices used in monastic kitchens and whether their primary role was flavor, preservation, or simply as a demonstration of the monastery's prosperity and connections. Sweeteners were also important. While refined sugar was a luxury, honey was readily available from the monastery's own beehives. You might find honey used to sweeten fruit dishes, to make a comforting dessert, or even as a base for medicinal concoctions. It provided not just sweetness, but also a complex flavor that sugar simply can't replicate. And for a tangy note, vinegar was commonly used, often made from soured wine or cider. A splash of vinegar could brighten a dish, cut through richness, or help preserve vegetables. So, while you won't be finding any medieval monks whipping up a 5-spice duck, you can be sure their meals had more depth and nuance than you might initially assume. They truly understood the art of making the most of what they had, a masterclass in resourceful cooking centuries before it became a popular television show. Behind the peaceful facade of prayer and study, the monastic kitchen was a surprisingly bustling and efficient operation. You might imagine a single monk stirring a pot over an open fire, but the reality was a well-organized, sometimes even large, space where a dedicated team worked tirelessly. This wasn't just cooking. It was a logistical challenge, feeding a community every single day, often with limited resources and under strict religious guidelines. Imagine stepping into the monastery kitchen. The air would be thick with the scent of simmering vegetables, baking bread, and perhaps the earthy aroma of brewing ale. You'd likely see robust stone hearths, possibly with multiple cooking areas, some for boiling large cauldrons of pottage, others for baking or roasting. There would be an array of simple but essential tools: large copper or iron cauldrons, heavy wooden spoons for stirring, grinding stones for spices, and rough wooden tables for food preparation. It was a place of practical industry, not culinary showmanship. The kitchen staff would typically consist of a mix of monks and lay brothers. The cellarer was a key figure, essentially the monastery's chief logistics officer. This monk was responsible for overseeing all provisions, from ordering or producing grain and cheese to managing the cellars where food was stored. He was the one who ensured there was enough of everything, a formidable task given the seasonal nature of medieval agriculture and the lack of modern refrigeration. Think of him as the ultimate medieval pantry manager, with a very serious commitment to preventing any monastic hangover. Under the cellarer, you'd have the cooks, often lay brothers, who were skilled in preparing the simple but nourishing meals. They knew how to make the most of basic ingredients, turning humble vegetables and grains into sustaining food. Their days would start early, preparing for the first meal, and continue almost until sundown, ensuring the evening meal was ready. Historians still argue about the exact division of labor within monastic kitchens and whether specific culinary roles were formalized or more ad hoc based on individual skills. What is clear, however, is that efficiency and cleanliness by medieval standards at least were paramount. A spoiled batch of food could mean hardship for the entire community. Beyond the main cooking area, you might find separate spaces for specific tasks: a small larder for storing perishables, a pantry for dry goods, and perhaps even a dedicated bakery or brewery nearby. The sheer scale of operations could be impressive, especially in larger monasteries that house hundreds of monks. It was a silent ballet of production, each person knowing their role, all contributing to the central mission of keeping the monastic body and soul nourished. It truly makes you appreciate modern conveniences like refrigerators and grocery stores when you consider the sheer effort involved in simply getting dinner on the table in a medieval monastery. No Uber Eats here, just consistent, laborious dedication. While the communal refectory meals were central to monastic life, food preparation sometimes extended beyond the refectory walls, particularly for two important groups, the sick and guests. You see, even in a world governed by strict rules, there was room for compassion and hospitality, and these often manifested through tailored culinary provisions. First, let's consider the infirmary. This was the monastic hospital, a quiet space, set apart where ailing monks could recover. Here, the rules of the main refectory were often relaxed. Imagine a monk, weak from fever or recovering from an injury, being brought a small bowl of nourishing broth, perhaps made from chicken, a rare treat in the main hall, or a richer, spiced wine. The emphasis in the infirmary was on healing and recovery, and that sometimes necessitated a different diet. The infirmera, the monk in charge of the sick, would often have access to a separate, smaller kitchen, or at least the ability to request special provisions from the main kitchen. This ensured that those who were unwell received the calories and nutrients needed for recuperation, even if it meant bending the usual dietary restrictions. Historians still argue whether the monastic infirmaries were genuinely effective medical institutions or primarily places of rest and comfort. However, their dietary allowances certainly suggest a practical approach to healing. Then there were the guests. Monasteries, by their very nature, were centers of hospitality. Travelers, pilgrims, and even noblemen often sought lodging and sustenance within their walls. Providing for guests was considered a sacred duty, a reflection of Christian charity. You wouldn't expect a weary traveler to adhere to the strict Lenten fasts of the monks, especially if they weren't intending to join the order. So, a separate guest house with its own dining area was common, and here, the menu would be notably more varied and often more generous. Imagine a tired traveler being offered not just bread and pottage, but perhaps some roasted fowl, or even a small portion of meat, accompanied by better quality ale or wine. The food served to guests was designed to be welcoming and representative of the monastery's generosity, reflecting the social standing of the guest where appropriate, but always aiming for comfort. The monastic cook would have to juggle these different demands, preparing simple, austere meals for the monks while simultaneously preparing more substantial and varied fare for visitors. It was a delicate balance of piety and practicality, showcasing the monastery's ability to adapt its resources to different needs. So, while you might find yourself quietly chewing on a hunk of rye bread in the refectory, your guest, just a stone's throw away, could be enjoying a comparatively lavish meal. It certainly makes you wonder if there was ever a bit of culinary envy across the monastery grounds. Beyond the ever-present ale, monks also consumed other beverages, each with its own purpose and place within the monastic diet. You've had your fill of thick, low-alcohol ale, but what else would you be sipping on in the quiet confines of the cloister? Water, surprisingly, wasn't always the primary drink, as we discussed. While spring water or well water was available, its purity couldn't always be guaranteed. However, for washing, cooking, and sometimes for drinking, it was certainly utilized, especially if the monastery had access to a particularly clean, fresh source. Imagine the cool, clear water from a mountain spring, a simple pleasure in a world without modern filtration systems. Historians still argue about the precise methods medieval monasteries used to assess water quality and whether their practices led to consistently safer drinking water than that available to the general population. More interestingly, though, were the various medicated wines and infusions. These weren't for getting tipsy, at least, not primarily, but for their perceived health benefits. Monasteries were often centers of medicinal knowledge, and their gardens, as you recall, were full of useful herbs. These herbs would be infused into wine, creating tonics for various ailments. Think of it as a medieval pharmacy in liquid form. You might be given a wine infused with sage for digestion, or one with lavender to aid sleep. These were often bitter, or strongly flavored, definitely not your modern dessert wines. It was a practical application of herbal law, aimed at maintaining the health of the community. On special occasions, or for guests, a monastery might even serve a higher quality wine. If the monastery itself had vineyards, they would produce their own. Otherwise, wine might be purchased or received as a gift. This wine would be a more refined beverage than the daily ale, reserved for moments of celebration or for demonstrating hospitality. Imagine the gentle clink of earthenware cups as a finer wine is poured during an Easter feast, a rare moment of sensory delight. Beyond these, there were simple fruit infusions or waters made from boiled fruits, offering a little flavor and sweetness, particularly in summer. These were not fermented, but offered a refreshing alternative. They were perhaps the closest thing to a soft drink you'd find. So, while the default was definitely ale, the monastic beverage menu was surprisingly nuanced, adapting to seasons, health needs, and social occasions. It reminds you that even within a life of austerity, there was a quiet appreciation for the nuances of taste and the practical benefits of nature's bounty. Food in a medieval monastery wasn't just about sustenance. It subtly, yet significantly, reflected social hierarchy within the community. You might think that in a place dedicated to equality before God, everyone would eat exactly the same thing, and largely, they did. But delve a little deeper, and you'll find nuanced differences that spoke volumes about status, role, and even health within the monastic order. The most obvious distinction would be found at the abbot's table. The abbot, as the head of the monastery, held a position of considerable authority and responsibility. While he was bound by the same Benedictine rule as his monks, his table often enjoyed certain privileges. Imagine the abbot hosting an important guest, perhaps a visiting bishop or a powerful noble. It would be unthinkable for him to serve the standard Lenten fare if his guest expected more. So, the abbot's meals, even when he ate alone, might be slightly more refined. You might find finer cuts of fish, a small portion of meat on non-fasting days, or a selection of more expensive spices and wines. This wasn't necessarily about personal indulgence, but about upholding the dignity of his office and the honor of the monastery when entertaining important figures. Historians still argue about the extent to which abbots genuinely deviated from the monastic diet for personal pleasure versus purely for reasons of hospitality and representation. Beyond the abbot, there were also subtle differences for senior monks or those with specific, demanding roles, like the prior or the cellarer. While they ate in the refectory with everyone else, their portions might sometimes be slightly larger, or they might receive a small additional allowance of ale or a piece of cheese. This was less about luxury and more about recognizing the physical demands of their administrative duties or their need for sustained energy. Think of it as a quiet acknowledgement of their greater burden, rather than a blatant display of favoritism. Conversely, newer, junior monks or novices might initially receive slightly smaller or simpler portions as part of their training in asceticism and humility. It was a gentle introduction to the rigors of monastic life, a way to instill discipline from the outset. You wouldn't find a fussy novice complaining about his gruel, that's for sure. Humility was part of the deal. Furthermore, distinctions could be made based on health or age. As we touched upon earlier, the sick received special provisions in the infirmary. Similarly, very elderly monks, whose digestive systems might struggle with the coarser monastic fare, could be given softer foods or easier to digest provisions. So, while the core of the monastic diet emphasized uniformity and humility, there was a quiet, practical hierarchy woven into the fabric of their meals, ensuring that each member, from the newest novice to the venerable abbot, received what was deemed appropriate for their station and needs. It was a system that, in its own way, tried to balance spiritual ideals with practical realities. Even in a community striving for spiritual perfection, human nature and digestive systems could lead to transgressions, and when they did, punishments related to food were a common and effective means of maintaining discipline. You wouldn't find a monk sent to the corner for sneaking an extra biscuit, but infractions against the rule, particularly those related to the refectory, were taken seriously. Imagine the atmosphere in the refectory, where silence was paramount. Any disturbance, a whispered conversation, a dropped utensil, or even an audible sigh of discontent, could be considered a breach of discipline. The punishment for such minor offences might be a simple, public reprimand from the abbot or prior. More severe, but still relatively light, might be a requirement to eat standing up in the refectory, a humble reminder of one's place and the importance of adhering to the rules. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of being sent to the naughty step, but with a side of spiritual reflection. More serious infractions, especially those involving food itself, could lead to harsher penalties. Stealing food, even a small amount, or hoarding provisions, would be seen as a grave sin against the community's shared resources and the vows of poverty. For such a transgression, a monk might be subjected to a reduced diet for a period. Instead of the regular bread and pottage, he might be given only water and dry bread, or even confined to a stricter fast. This wasn't just about physical discomfort. It was about spiritual penance, a forced reflection on the sin of gluttony or greed. Historians still argue about the frequency and severity of these food-related punishments, and whether they truly reformed behavior or simply instilled fear. Consider the monk who might complain about the quality or quantity of the food in a community dedicated to humility and gratitude. Such a complaint would be viewed as a lack of piety. The punishment might involve public confession of the fault, followed by a period of silent penance where the monk would eat only the most meagre fare, served without any of the small comforts usually afforded. You wouldn't want to be that monk, the one everyone silently watches as you chew your dry crust. The ultimate punishment, of course, was expulsion, but before that, a monk might be completely excommunicated from the communal meals for a period, forced to eat alone in his cell or in a secluded part of the monastery, reflecting on his actions in solitude. This social isolation, far more than the dietary restriction itself, would have been a profoundly impactful punishment in a community built on shared life. So, while the monastic diet aimed for simplicity, the rules surrounding its consumption were anything but, ensuring that every bite reinforced the strict discipline of the monastery. The medieval monastic diet, like all life in that era, was profoundly influenced by seasonal changes. You couldn't just pop down to the supermarket for strawberries in December, after all. The availability of food shifted dramatically with the turning of the year, dictating what appeared on your plate and how it was prepared. This forced monasteries to be incredibly resourceful and to live in a close, respectful relationship with the natural world. Imagine late spring and summer. This was a time of relative abundance. The monastic gardens would be bursting with fresh produce. You'd see vibrant green leaves, tender shoots, and the first of the season's peas and beans. This meant lighter, fresher meals with a greater variety of vegetables. The fish ponds would be active, providing a steady supply, and if the monastery had orchards, the first fruits would begin to ripen, offering welcome sweetness. Think of the joy of biting into a crisp, fresh apple after months of dried or preserved fare. It was a seasonal explosion of flavor, a quiet celebration of nature's generosity. As autumn approached, the focus would shift to harvesting and preservation. This was a period of intense labor, gathering the bounty from the fields, gardens, and orchards. Grains would be threshed and stored. Vegetables like root crops would be pulled and carefully placed in cool, dark cellars for winter. Fruits would be dried, made into preserves, or fermented. This was a race against time, ensuring enough food was put away to last through the lean months ahead. You might see monks carefully layering apples with straw or hanging bunches of herbs to dry, a quiet industry that underscored their self-reliance. Historians still argue about the precise techniques used for storing certain delicate vegetables and how effective they truly were in preventing spoilage over long periods. Winter, of course, brought the leanest times. The fresh produce was gone, and the diet would rely heavily on preserved foods. This meant a predominance of dried peas and beans, root vegetables from the cellar, salted or dried fish, and, of course, the ever-present bread and ale. Meals would be heartier, designed to provide warmth and energy in the cold. Imagine a thick pottage made from dried pulses, flavored with stored herbs, a truly comforting meal after a frigid morning of prayers. The rhythm of the monastic kitchen, therefore, mirrored the rhythm of the earth itself, a constant dance with the seasons, ensuring that no matter the weather, the monks would be fed. It was a testament to their resilience and their deep understanding of agricultural cycles, a far cry from our modern, seasonless access to every food imaginable. To combat the challenges of seasonal scarcity, monasteries developed sophisticated innovations in food preservation. You see, unlike us with our refrigerators and freezers, medieval monks had to rely on time-honored, often ingenious, methods to ensure a steady supply of food through the winter and beyond. These techniques weren't just practical. They were crucial for survival. One of the most fundamental methods was salting. Imagine barrels overflowing with fish, layered with thick salt. Salt effectively draws out moisture, preventing the growth of bacteria and preserving the food for months. This was particularly important for fish, which, as we've discussed, was a vital protein source. So, while a fresh trout from the pond was a delight, the salted cod or herring stored in the cellar was the true lifeline. This process wasn't just for fish. Meat, when it was permitted, would also be salted and sometimes smoked. You might catch a whiff of curing meat from a smokehouse as you pass by, a pungent aroma signaling future meals. Drying was another widespread technique. Fruits, particularly apples and plums, would be sliced and laid out in the sun or hung in airy, dry spaces, sometimes even above a slow-burning fire, to remove their moisture. Vegetables like peas and beans were also dried, becoming tough little nuggets that could be rehydrated and cooked into nourishing pottage later. Imagine rows upon rows of fruit segments, slowly shriveling, concentrating their sweetness, a simple yet effective way to capture summer's bounty. These dried goods were lightweight and lasted for a very long time, making them ideal for storage. For many vegetables, root cellars were essential. These were cool, dark, and slightly damp underground spaces where crops like carrots, parsnips, and turnips could be stored for months without spoiling. The consistent temperature and humidity prevented them from freezing or rotting too quickly. You might see a monk carefully checking the stored vegetables, ensuring no spoilage threatened the winter's provisions. Then there was fermentation. While we already talked about ale, fermentation was also used for other foods. Cheese making was common, transforming milk into a long-lasting and nutrient-dense food. Some vegetables might also be lacto-fermented, similar to making sauerkraut, though specific medieval recipes for this are less well documented. These methods not only preserved food, but often enhanced its flavor and digestibility. Historians still argue about the exact origins of some medieval preservation techniques and whether monastic practices were widely adopted by the general population or remained unique to the cloister. What is clear, however, is that these monks were masters of making food last, turning perishable harvests into year-round sustenance through patient, meticulous effort. It truly makes you appreciate the engineering marvel that is your modern refrigerator, doesn't it? As our journey through the medieval monastic kitchen draws to a close, let's reflect on the profound legacy of monastic cuisine. You might think of it as a relic of the past, but the quiet, disciplined culinary practices within those ancient walls left an indelible mark on Western cooking and, surprisingly, on your modern plate. One of the most significant contributions was the emphasis on self-sufficiency and organized agriculture. Monasteries were often pioneers in land management, drainage, crop rotation, and animal husbandry. The knowledge gained from meticulously tending their gardens, fish ponds, and fields contributed to broader agricultural advancements across Europe. Remember those well-managed fish ponds? They laid some of the groundwork for modern aquaculture. The systematic way they cultivated herbs for both food and medicine also preserved and advanced botanical knowledge through the ages. You might not realize it, but the orderly rows in your local community garden owe a quiet nod to medieval monastic plots. Furthermore, monastic communities played a crucial role in preserving culinary knowledge and recipes. While not always written down in formal cookbooks, the practices, techniques, and recipes were passed down through generations of monks and lay brothers. They refined methods for brewing, baking, cheese-making, and food preservation that became foundational to European cuisine. Many traditional breads, cheeses, and even some styles of beer that you enjoy today have roots tracing back to monastic kitchens. Historians still argue about the true extent of monastic influence on secular cooking, but the evidence suggests a significant impact. particularly in the consistency and quality of staple foods. Beyond the practical, there was the underlying philosophy. The monastic diet, with its emphasis on simplicity, moderation, and seasonality, offered a profound counterpoint to the excesses of the aristocratic table. It highlighted the spiritual value of food, not just as fuel, but as a gift to be consumed. With gratitude and discipline, this focus on wholesome, natural ingredients and a mindful approach to eating resonates even today with movements towards sustainable and locally sourced food. So, as you slowly drift off, remember the quiet dedication of those medieval monks. They weren't just eating to live, they were living to pray, and their meals were an integral part of that sacred journey. From the dense loaf of rye bread to the simple fish from the pond, every morsel was consumed with purpose, contributing to a way of life that shaped not only religious history but also the very foundations of how we eat. Their kitchens, though humble, were truly laboratories of culinary and spiritual ingenuity, the quiet engines of a self-sufficient world. As your eyelids grow heavy and the gentle hum of the night settles around you, let the stillness of the medieval monastery wash over you, the scent of old stone, damp earth, and the faint, comforting aroma of baking bread. It's all part of a history that whispers rather than shouts. Feel the quiet rhythm of their days, the rise and fall of the seasons, the patient labor that brought food to their table. There's a peace in this ancient routine, a steady, unchanging world where every meal was a moment of reflection. Let the simple, honest flavors of their lives lull you into a deep, restorative sleep. All the worries of your own day can gently recede now, like the last embers of a distant hearth, just quiet and calm.